The lifeboat arrived like the ocean was trying to return something it had borrowed. Not gently, not politely, just deposited, thrown up onto the wet sand and left there at the edge of the tide, where the water could still touch it if it wanted to reclaim it, but not so far out that it could pretend it never happened. It was one of those mornings when the coastline feels like a secret you weren't invited to. Gray light, heavy clouds, the kind of wind that doesn't howl but presses against your ribs like it's checking how steady you are. Oscar Levin walked this beach every day. People said he did it for his knees. People said he did it because retirement makes time feel too loud. Both were true, but the real reason was simpler and darker. If he didn't keep moving, his mind would wander back to the old stories, and the old stories here weren't entertainment, they were warnings. His dog, scruffy shepherd mix, stubborn as a dock rope, raced ahead, then stopped short in a way that made Oscar's stomach tighten. Dogs don't do that for driftwood. Dogs do that for things that are wrong. Oscar followed, boots sinking slightly into wet sand, and he saw it. A lifeboat. Hard-sided, old. Chalky white paint turned sickly like teeth that had lived too long. Cracks spidering along the rim. Seaweed hanging off the hull like hair. Rope knotted and frayed, glued in places by dried salt. It sat crooked in the sand, angled as if it had been dragged from the sea in a hurry and dumped with irritation. Oscar froze because he knew that shape. Not this exact boat, not a serial number he could swear to, but the era of it. The kind of lifeboat you saw in old harbor photos, in yellowing newspaper clippings pinned to corkboards, in the town's memory where some images never soften. He swallowed, and his throat felt dry in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. For decades, this coastline carried one unresolved bruise. 3 fishermen had gone out and never come back. No bodies, no wreckage. No final radio call, just a storm that rolled in, and then the long blank silence where answers should have been. Harris Cole, Marek Sova, Dean Riker. The names weren't legend. They were part of daily language here. People said them when the sky got dark. People said them when a young deckhand acted cocky about the water. People said them the way you say, "Watch your step," without thinking. Oscar stared at the lifeboat and tried to do what humans always do when they see trouble. Rationalize it away. Maybe it was from another coast. Maybe it was from a wreck that had nothing to do with them. Maybe it was just junk, dragged in by currents, and his mind was being dramatic because the sea always makes you dramatic if you live long enough beside it. His dog sniffed the sand around the hull and backed away, ears low, tail stiff. Oscar stepped closer anyway, and that's when he noticed the notebook. It was tucked under a slat near the stern, not floating loose like trash, not half buried like forgotten paper, wedged there like someone had hidden it with intention. Black cover, plain, no title, no strap, just a simple notebook, the kind you'd buy in a grocery store when you needed somewhere to put words and didn't want anyone noticing. Oscar crouched. He reached for it with 2 fingers first, like it might bite. He pulled it free, and the world tilted slightly. Dry, not damp, but usable, not maybe it survived. Dry the way something is dry when it has been protected, sealed, wrapped, kept out of water by design, not luck. The cover was firm. The pages didn't cling. The corners weren't soft. No smell of mold, no swelling, no warped spine. Oscar stood with the notebook in his hands and felt something sour in his gut. The fear that he'd just become the person who touched the beginning of a story nobody wanted. He didn't open it. He didn't want sand in it, wind flipping pages, salt spray smudging ink. He didn't want his curiosity to be the reason evidence turned into rumor. So he backed away, pulled out his phone, and called the harbor office. His voice came out tight, almost angry, like anger could protect him from what he'd found. "There's a lifeboat," he said. "Old one, washed up, and there's something inside it. It's not right." The person on the other end asked questions. Where, what size, did he see anyone? Did he see blood? Did he see a body? Because that's what the job teaches you to ask. "No," Oscar said too quickly. "No bodies, but you need to come. Now." The first patrol truck arrived fast. Another followed, then a Coast Guard vehicle with lights off but posture on, like even the vehicles were trying not to draw attention. Too late. People in this town noticed everything. By the time Officer Lena Voss stepped onto the beach with a clipboard and a steady face, there was already a small crowd at a distance. Folks who just happened to be walking. Folks who heard something. Folks who stood with arms folded like judges and stared at the lifeboat as if the ocean owed them an explanation. Lena moved with practiced calm. She walked a slow circle around the boat. She scanned the sand. She looked at the tide line, the direction of drag marks, the seaweed patterns. She wasn't dramatic. She was the kind of person who knew drama-ruined scenes. "Who found it?" she asked. Oscar raised his hand. Lena asked him where he had stepped, what he had touched, what he had moved. When he mentioned the notebook and said it was dry, Lena's eyes sharpened in a way that made Oscar's spine tighten. She signaled for evidence sleeves and gloves. She had the lifeboat photographed in place from multiple angles before anyone touched it again. She had another officer keep the crowd back, because crowds love to step on truth. Then Lena looked at the notebook in Oscar's hands. "Hand it to me like it's glass," she said. Oscar did. Lena slid it carefully into a clear sleeve without opening it further, sealed it, and for a fraction of a second, the calm mask on her face cracked into something else. Not panic, disbelief. The lifeboat was lifted and moved to a secure bay. The notebook went separately, treated like a living thing that can be killed by mishandling. The crowd murmured. Phones lifted. Someone whispered the old names. Someone else shushed them like it was bad luck. Oscar stood on the beach a little longer than he needed to, watching the sea roll in and out like it was practicing innocence. By afternoon, the town had already built 10 versions of the story. By evening, the families had been called. That's how these things always happen. The truth arrives in a quiet way, and then humans turn it into thunder. In the station's evidence room, under bright, clean lights that felt too modern for something this old, Lena opened the notebook for the first time. The first page held one line in neat block letters, ink unblurred, paper crisp. "If you found this, we didn't drown." Lena didn't move for a few seconds. Her eyes traced the words like her brain was trying to reject them. Then she called Detective Ray Whitaker. Ray had spent years living in the strange limbo of unresolved cases. Cold case work does something to you. It teaches you patience, yes, but it also teaches you a kind of cautious cynicism. Most new leads are nothing. Most breakthroughs turn into dead ends. Grief loves to manufacture hope. But when Lena said dry notebook and then read the line aloud, Ray's voice dropped immediately. "Keep it secured," he said. "Don't let anyone photograph that page. Not yet. I'm coming. The station's atmosphere changed the moment Ray arrived. You could feel it. Officers walking softer, voices lowering, eyes flicking toward the evidence room like there was a storm inside it. Ray entered, saw the open notebook, and went still. He read the line once, then again. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He looked like a man who had just been handed something heavy and dangerous. How many people have seen this? He asked. Just us, Lena said. And whoever wrote it. Ray nodded once as if locking a decision into place. Then he turned the page. The notebook wasn't poetic. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies are dramatic. It was practical, written like a man who didn't trust memory to stay honest and didn't have time for pretty language. Short entries, simple observations, dates, but not obsessive timelines. Notes that felt like they were written with cold hands. And from the first full entry onward, something became painfully clear. The fishermen didn't vanish because of a storm. They vanished because of people. Dean Riker wrote about the water turning wrong before the weather did, currents shifting against the wind, surface ripples moving in patterns that made no sense, a metallic smell in the air like pennies and oil. Marek joked about ghost water, the old sailor phrase for when the sea feels haunted. Harris didn't joke back. Then they saw a vessel, low in the water, dark, moving without a visible wake. No obvious name, no friendly flag. It stayed at a distance that felt deliberate, like it was watching them, like it was waiting. Dean wrote that Harris tried to hail it anyway. Fishermen do that. It's part courtesy, part caution, part survival. You don't ignore another craft out there, no response. Then the Seabird's engine began to fail. Dean described it as starvation, not breakage. Fuel line checked, filter checked. Everything looked normal, and yet the engine coughed, sputtered, and died in uneven bursts. The dark vessel drew closer. Then Dean wrote something that made Ray's jaw tighten. They threw a rope ladder over our side. Not a collision, not a rescue attempt. A ladder tossed like they expected to board and expected compliance. The next entry's handwriting was messier, tighter, like the writer's hand had started to shake. 2 men climbed aboard. Calm, efficient. They carried firearms held low, not waved around, not shown off, just present like tools. Harris tried to talk. Marek tried to memorize faces. Dean tried not to stare at the weapons. The men ordered the radio off. They ordered the Seabird to change course. Harris hesitated, then complied because their engine was failing and weather was shifting. He believed cooperation would keep them alive long enough to find a way out. That decision sat in the notebook like a stone. Dean wrote that they were forced toward deeper water, where the horizon looks emptier and the sea gets darker. Later, the Seabird was tied alongside a larger ship, one they hadn't seen from the harbor, one that didn't feel like it belonged to any lawful system. Dean wrote about gloved hands and tools, about the sound of metal being cut. Then he wrote the sentence that explained what had haunted this case for decades. They don't want the Seabird to be found. Ray sat back for a moment and stared at that line. It explained everything that never made sense. The lack of debris, the absence of an oil slick, the way the storm became a convenient explanation. Dean wrote that he hid the notebook that night, wrapped in plastic, wrapped again, tucked under a slat in a lifeboat. He wrote the first page message because he understood how easy it would be for the world to accept drowning. Drowning is simple. Drowning closes files. Drowning doesn't demand uncomfortable questions. If you found this, we didn't drown. The entries shifted from sea to something worse. They were moved to a place that smelled like diesel and old wood, concrete floors, generator hum, doors that shut with the confident finality of money. Dean wrote that they were separated. Harris taken first, Marek next. Dean left alone. He wrote about forms, names, fingerprints, signatures. He wrote about threats and promises that changed depending on whether he looked cooperative. The men told him the world already believed they were dead. That line hit Ray harder than he expected because it was true. The storm rolled in, and everyone accepted the simplest story. It was easier to blame nature than to admit humans can erase humans. Dean wrote about punishment that didn't need blood, isolation, silence, time without clocks. He escaped once, briefly, slipped through a door, found a window, saw water outside, boats, smelled land that wasn't their coast. He tried to climb out. He was caught. After that, the entries became smaller, steadier, writing as a kind of proof that he still existed. He wrote that he heard Marek coughing in another room. He wrote that he never heard Harris. He didn't know if Harris was alive or moved or broken or dead. The uncertainty sat on every page. Near the end, the tone changed. They are moving us. Dean wrote that the facility was clearing out. Tense voices, equipment loaded. Someone was afraid of something coming. Marek was brought back, alive but weak, eyes too bright. They were shoved onto a boat again, taken out under cover of darkness. Then the lifeboat, they put us in it. No oars, no radio, no flares. The men said the ocean would finish what they started, that even if the fishermen survived, nobody would believe them, that they were ghosts now either way. The last entry cut off mid-thought. No farewell, no dramatic final sentence, just blank space like the notebook had been snatched away or the writer had been forced to stop. Ray sat back in silence, staring at the absence. Lena watched his face and knew what he was thinking because she was thinking it too. The notebook was dry. That detail still sat in the room like a threat. "How is it dry?" Lena asked quietly. Ray turned the cover over, inspected the binding, looked for signs of a waterproof lining. The notebook showed salt exposure on the outside, but the pages, those pages were too clean. Either he sealed it perfectly, Ray said, or someone kept it safe. That second option made Lena's stomach drop, because if someone else kept it safe, then the lifeboat didn't drift in by accident. It was delivered. The town found out fast because secrets don't survive coastal towns. Someone saw the lifeboat being towed. Someone heard notebook. Someone guessed the old names. By nightfall, people stood at the harbor staring out at the sea, as if staring hard enough could make it confess. Ray contacted the families. Dean Riker's sister Naomi arrived first, eyes sharp with decades of disbelief. Harris Cole's son Jordan came next, older now than his father had been when he vanished, jaw tight like he refused grief, another victory. Marek Sova's widow Anya arrived last, moving slowly, as if even walking toward this conversation cost her something. They sat in a small room with plastic chairs and stale coffee smell. Ray and Lena faced them with the careful posture of people who know that words can change lives. Ray explained, "Lifeboat washed ashore, notebook dry, message says they didn't drown, notebook describes forced boarding and concealment." Naomi covered her mouth with her hand and stared like she was trying to keep herself from collapsing into hope. Jordan asked too calmly, "Is it real?" Ray said the notebook would be authenticated. Ink, paper, handwriting, everything. Anya whispered, "Does it say where they are?" Ray hesitated because honesty was heavy. It describes what happened, he said. It doesn't give a map. That room filled with the kind of silence that isn't empty. It's packed with decades. Ray didn't show them every page yet. He didn't want to drop the whole weight at once. But even the first line was enough to crack old grief open like a shell. If you found this, we didn't drown. The notebook went to the lab. Ray reopened the original case file. Thick, dusty, full of official language, trying to make tragedy orderly. Departure confirmed. Check-in missed. Weather deteriorated. Search conducted. No findings. The old file had always bothered investigators because the sea usually leaves something. Debris, gear, a cooler, a piece of tarp. Something. This case left nothing. Now Ray understood why. He also understood nothing more uncomfortable. If this was true, then the disappearance wasn't just a crime. It was a crime that worked. It stayed buried for decades. That meant luck, or help, or both. Lab results came back in stages. The paper stock matched the era. The ink formulation matched older ballpoint types. The cover showed salt exposure. The interior pages showed far less water damage than expected. Protected. Handwriting analysis suggested the first page line and most entries were written by Dean Riker. Naomi recognized Dean's block letters immediately. Jordan didn't know what to feel because it wasn't his father's writing, but it still dragged the case closer to reality. Anya's face went very still because she remembered Merrick practicing English letters at the kitchen table, copying forms, trying to fit into a country that never fully felt like his. Ray read the notebook again and again. Each pass surfaced details. The dark vessel, the calm professionalism, the gloved hands, the cutting tools, the facility by water. It sounded like a system. Ray started hunting patterns. Old maritime enforcement reports, smuggling cases, private dock permits, shell companies. He kept seeing rumors in margins. Unmarked ships, night transfers, private facilities with restricted access that nobody could fully explain. A name surfaced in dockside whispers, the Lantern Fleet. Not an official organization, more like a nickname people used when they saw strange lights at sea and learned to look away. Ray requested sealed files connected to old investigations. Some were denied. Some were missing. Some came back with pages removed, like someone had physically erased history. The first warning arrived quickly. A plain envelope on Ray's desk. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with one line typed in clean letters. Let the sea keep its secrets. Ray logged it, photographed it, reported it. He kept digging. Lena asked him a quiet question in the hallway. You think someone's watching this? Ray didn't answer immediately. Then he said, someone doesn't want it reopened. Lena did something Ray hadn't expected. She contacted a journalist. Paige Marlowe had a reputation for maritime corruption stories. She'd exposed illegal fishing operations, bribery networks, shell companies. She was half hero and half nightmare, depending on who you asked. Paige met Ray and Lena in a small office with blinds half drawn, like the room itself didn't want to be seen. Give me something real, she said, not rumors. Something I can publish that can't be ignored. Ray didn't want the notebook turned into entertainment, but he also knew the system that buried this case relied on silence. So he gave Paige one excerpt. If you found this, we didn't drown. Paige published carefully, initially without names, focusing on the evidence and the impossibility of it. The story exploded anyway. People love mysteries, especially when they smell like conspiracy and ocean. But the real reaction came from those who'd been holding secrets. Ray's phone began ringing with calls. Many were nonsense, but some carried the heavy weight of truth. Specific, reluctant, fearful. One call stood out. A man named Thomas Baird refused to talk on the phone. He insisted on meeting in person, in public, with windows. They met in a diner off the highway. Thomas sat with his back to the wall, coffee untouched, eyes scanning the room like he expected someone to walk in and end him. Thomas had worked tugboats decades ago. The year the fisherman vanished, he'd been contracted to assist a vessel docking at a private coastal facility, not supposed to be used for commercial operations. The ship had no name painted on the side, no flag, but it had lights arranged in a pattern that made it recognizable to the right people, lantern-like. Thomas said the crew wasn't like fishermen, too disciplined, too calm, too quiet. He said he helped guide container units off the ship. The units were handled carefully, too carefully. He heard voices from inside one unit, not machinery, not animals, people. Thomas admitted he did nothing. He needed the job. He had a family. He swallowed guilt for decades. Then he said the thing that made Ray's body go cold. He saw three men briefly when a door was opened. One of them had an anchor tattoo with initials beneath it. Ray pulled up an old photo from the case file and slid it across the table. Dean Riker's forearm, anchor tattoo. Thomas nodded once, hard. That's him, Thomas said. Dean had been alive after the disappearance. Ray took a formal statement, arranged protection, contacted federal maritime investigators. This was no longer a local cold case. It was trafficking, concealment, organized crime. The private facility Thomas described still existed on paper, but ownership was a maze of dissolved shell companies. The buildings were abandoned. The fences sagged. The place looked like nothing, which is exactly what secret's like. Ray and Lena went there with the team. They searched concrete bays, rusted generator housings, false walls, storage pits. They moved slow and methodical because places like this punish haste. They didn't find people, they found proof people had been there. Behind a panel in one bay, carved into concrete with something sharp, were three names. Harris, Merrick, Dean underneath. We were here. Lena covered her mouth with her gloved hand. Ray stared until his eyes burned. It meant time. Time beyond the storm, beyond the initial abduction. Time long enough to carve a message. Page kept publishing, turning pressure into heat. It became harder for agencies to pretend this was nothing. Officials were asked questions on camera. Old records were subpoenaed. People who enjoyed decades of silence suddenly felt eyes on them again. Warnings escalated. Ray found a note under his windshield wiper one morning. Stop digging. You won't like what surfaces. He logged it, reported it, kept going. Then the notebook delivered its strangest twist. Lab technicians found the last pages sealed together, not by water damage, but by a resin-like sealant. When separated carefully, a final entry appeared written in a different hand, not Dean's, tighter script, controlled, educated. We kept this so the truth could surface when it was safe. The sea doesn't forget, it just delays. Ray read the line twice, then stared at it like it had insulted him, because it meant the notebook changed hands. Dean hid it. Someone else preserved it. Someone else decided when it would be released. A whistleblower, a guilty participant, a rival in the network, someone who wanted revenge. Ray didn't know, but he knew this. The lifeboat didn't drift in by random luck. It had been timed, delivered. That realization changed the entire tone of the investigation. It wasn't just reopening a case, it was stepping onto a board someone had set up, waiting for the right person to step on it. Ray began to suspect the notebook wasn't just evidence, it was bait. And if it was bait, then someone wanted something, wanted attention somewhere, wanted pressure on someone, wanted a particular set of eyes looking in a particular direction. He started looking for what the notebook didn't say. It mentioned a facility by water, but didn't name it. It mentioned forms, but didn't mention names on them. It mentioned a larger ship, but didn't describe a flag. The writer had been careful, or someone had edited the story by omission. Ray and Lena focused on the Lantern Fleet rumor and began cross-referencing modern seizures. Patterns emerged, routes that still looked familiar, shell companies that dissolved and reappeared under new names, private docks that changed ownership quickly. The case was widening into the present, which meant danger was no longer theoretical. One evening, Lena left the station and found her car's rear tire sliced cleanly, not like an accident, a warning that said, "We can reach you without touching you." Ray's apartment door showed faint scratch marks near the lock. Someone had tested it, or wanted him to know they had. Ray told the families to be careful. He didn't tell them everything. He didn't want to turn them into targets, but he increased patrol near their homes anyway. Naomi didn't like it. She hated being treated like fragile glass. She had lived with this absence for decades. She wasn't fragile. Jordan didn't like it either. He was quiet, but his quiet had a hard edge. He asked Ray what he wasn't saying. Ray told him enough. There were signs someone didn't want the past exposed. Jordan's jaw tightened. "So my father vanished," he said, "and now the truth is still being threatened. That's what you're saying." Ray didn't deny it. Anya listened with eyes that looked tired beyond age. She said she'd spent decades afraid of storms, only to learn storms had been a convenient lie. "It's almost funny," she said softly. "The sea got blamed for men." Ray kept working. Federal partners traced a defunct shell company connected to the abandoned facility. That shell company linked, through a chain of paperwork that looked deliberately messy, to a shipping brokerage that still existed, modern, clean, respectable. A front. They began building a case. Then a new event forced their hand. A boat was intercepted offshore by Coast Guard patrol, not because they were hunting it specifically, but because it was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It tried to avoid contact. It moved without a visible fishing purpose. It carried no proper identifiers. The interception didn't produce a cinematic shootout. It produced something more realistic. Polite refusals, paperwork games, calm men with confident eyes. But in the hidden compartment of that boat, investigators found waterproof roll-top bags. Inside one bag, sealed and wrapped, was a ledger. Not a notebook like Dean's, but a ledger listing transfers, dates, cargo codes. It wasn't fully readable without context, but it had the feel of structure, the kind of structure Dean's notebook implied. Ray felt the case shift again, like a hook sinking deeper. Someone inside the system was leaking, or the system was cracking. Paige Marlowe published a new piece focusing on present-day interceptions and the connection to old disappearances. Public pressure increased. Suddenly, officials, who had been quietly resistant, became loudly supportive, because nothing changes a politician's spine like cameras. Ray and Lana returned to the abandoned facility with federal teams and forensics. They dug deeper. They found hidden compartments, false walls, sealed drains that suggested evidence had been washed away. They found scratch marks that looked like restraints had once been bolted into concrete, removed now but remembered by the holes. They found more writing in hidden corners, single names, initials, numbers that meant nothing until they meant everything. They found a strip of old tape stuck to the underside of a metal shelf, brittle with age. Inside that tape, rolled tight, was a small piece of paper, protected from water and air. Ray unfolded it with gloves and felt his breath catch. It was a partial list of names, not the fishermen's names, other names, dozens, a catalog of disappearance. That discovery changed the story again. It wasn't only about Harris, Merrick, and Dean. It was about a system that had used the sea to erase people repeatedly. Page's reporting expanded. People from other coastal towns began contacting her with their own lost at sea stories that never made sense. Some were probably normal tragedies, some were not. Ray's case became part of something bigger than he wanted. The families reacted differently. Naomi became obsessed with the notebook. She wanted to read every line, to taste every detail like it could substitute for her brother's voice. She asked Ray if Dean ever mentioned her. The notebook didn't. That hurt in a quiet, selfish way that Naomi hated herself for. Of course, Dean didn't mention her. Dean was trying to survive. Jordan became obsessed with Thomas's statement. The fact that Dean was seen alive didn't comfort him. It enraged him, because it meant someone had stolen time from his father and his family. Anya became strangely calm, like the truth had settled her into a new kind of grief. Not softer, just cleaner. She stopped blaming the ocean. She started blaming men, and in a way that felt easier because men can be confronted. Then came the hardest moment, a DNA match. Not for Harris, not for Dean, for Merrick. A body recovered years earlier on a distant coast, cataloged under an unidentified record, finally matched Marek Sova's DNA through updated databases and international cooperation. Anya received the news in a small room with plastic chairs and stale air, and she didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for decades and didn't realize it. "Bring him home," she said. Ray promised he would. Naomi and Jordan listened to that news with complicated faces. It was proof, and proof was everything. But it was also a reminder. Proof can arrive too late. Ray continued running DNA sweeps. He continued contacting international agencies. He continued sifting through old, unidentified remains. He continued because the notebook's line had become a responsibility. "If you found this, we didn't drown." That sentence demanded action. Then, months into the investigation, a new lead surfaced from an unexpected direction. A man contacted Paige Marlowe anonymously through encrypted channels. He claimed to have worked for a shipping brokerage connected to the Lantern Fleet network. He claimed he had information about the fisherman case. He refused to meet Paige alone. He demanded law enforcement be present. He demanded protection. Ray and Lena arranged a meeting in a secure location. The man arrived with a hood up, hands shaking, eyes darting like he expected a bullet at any moment. He was younger than Ray expected, mid-30s maybe. Someone who had grown up in the era after the fisherman disappeared, but had inherited the system's machinery. He didn't give his real name. He gave a nickname, Kellen. Kellen said the network had evolved. The old Lantern Fleet nickname was still used internally like a brand. The routes shifted, the cargo changed, but the method stayed the same. The sea erased, the sea obscured, the sea provided plausible deniability. He said the fishermen were an accident in one sense. They weren't targeted initially. They stumbled into something. They saw a transfer. They were in the wrong place. But once they were in it, the network couldn't release them. Kellen said the facility Ray found had been a temporary holding site. People weren't kept there long term. They were moved. Moved where? Kellen didn't know exact locations, but he described a pattern. Offshore transfers, private docks, trucks, then farther inland. He said there were contracts with corrupt officials in various regions. He said people were used as labor on ships, in warehouses, in places where no one asked questions because everyone had a reason to pretend not to see. Ray asked about Harris Cole. Kellen hesitated, then said something that made the room go colder. He said there was a rumor inside the network about the one fisherman who took the deal. Ray felt Lena's eyes on him. What deal? Ray asked. Kellen swallowed. He said one of the fishermen agreed to cooperate, not because he was evil, but because cooperation was the only way offered to stay alive. He said the network used that as a lesson internally. If you break one man, you can use him to control others. Ray asked if that fisherman was Harris. Kellen didn't confirm. He said he didn't know. But he said something else. The fisherman was later given a new identity and placed in a coastal town far away under supervision like a controlled asset. Ray felt his jaw tighten, because if Harris had been alive, hidden, turned into a quiet prisoner living in plain sight, then the case wasn't just about a disappearance. It was about stolen lives disguised as survival. Ray asked why the notebook surfaced now. Kellen's answer was careful. He said there had been internal conflict. People retiring, people wanting out, people feeling the pressure of modern surveillance. He said someone inside the network believed the old crimes were a liability. Someone wanted to cut loose the past, but someone else believed the past could be used as leverage. So evidence was released strategically, a confession timed like a weapon. Ray left the meeting feeling both closer and farther from the truth, because the closer you get to systems like this, the more you realize they are built to keep you forever chasing. But the case did move forward. Federal teams began making arrests for modern offenses tied to the same routes. Ships were seized, shell companies were frozen, accounts were examined, private docks were inspected, and some old names began to surface, names connected to port authorities, to shipping brokers, to people who had long lived comfortable lives. The town watched all of it like a storm on the horizon, fascinated, afraid, unable to look away. Naomi became a fixture at the station. She brought old samples of Dean's handwriting, old photos, old letters. She wanted to help. She wanted to prove the notebook belonged to her brother, not only through lab results, but through human recognition. Jordan brought nothing but questions. He pushed Ray, demanded updates, demanded action. He had lived too long with, "We're doing what we can." Anya, after Merrick's DNA match, focused on bringing him home. She made calls, filled paperwork, talked to consulates. Her grief had a mission now. Ray kept digging for Harris and Dean. He couldn't promise they were alive, but he couldn't accept that they were dead without proof. The notebook refused that kind of closure. One night, Ray sat alone with the case file and reread the notebook again. Not the sensational parts, the small parts, the practical parts. He noticed a detail he had ignored before. Dean described a smell when they were moved, Fuel, rust, fish, old wood, and later a shift. Warmer air, different salt smell, something like citrus in the wind. Citrus. That wasn't their coast. Ray pulled maps, not of official shipping lanes, but of ocean currents and trade winds. He looked at which regions could produce citrus-laced coastal air. He looked at where a network might move people to avoid attention. He didn't need an exact location. He needed possibilities. He passed the analysis to federal partners. They cross-referenced with known trafficking routes and labor exploitation sites. Weeks later, a lead came back, an island port used for illegal transfers. Long rumored, rarely proven. Ray and Lena joined a task force operation. It wasn't dramatic. It was tense and slow and full of paperwork, surveillance, waiting in vehicles with stale air. The sea doesn't give you clean moments. It gives you long stretches of quiet and then sudden violence. They watched a private dock at night. They saw vessels arrive without formal clearance. They saw trucks move in and out. They waited for the right moment. When the operation finally moved, it moved like a wave. Fast, coordinated, loud enough to disrupt, but careful enough to preserve evidence. They seized records. They detained crew. They secured cargo. And in a storage office near the dock, they found a small box of personal items. Watches, rings, old IDs, things that looked like they belonged to people who had been moved and erased. One item made Ray's breath catch, a battered wallet. Inside it, faded by time, was a photo of a young man with a broad smile, arm around another man, both standing near a fishing boat. Dean Riker. Ray stared until the room narrowed, because the photo didn't prove Dean was alive now, but it proved Dean had been here at some point, or that someone had kept his belongings as trophies, which was another kind of horror. Ray logged it, bagged it, sent it for analysis. He didn't tell Naomi yet because he needed to confirm it wasn't a cruel coincidence. The operation led to more arrests, more testimony, more cracks. The network didn't collapse all at once. Systems like this rarely do. But it began to fracture. Then, unexpectedly, Ray got a call from a small coastal town far away. An older man had been found wandering near a marina, disoriented, dehydrated, speaking in fragments. He carried no ID. He insisted his name was Harris, then insisted it wasn't. He refused to answer questions about where he'd been. The local officer calling Ray sounded uneasy. "He keeps saying the sea didn't take them," the officer said. "He keeps saying he's sorry." Ray's heart pounded in a way that surprised him. He forced his voice steady. "Keep him safe," Ray said. "Don't push him hard. I'm coming." Ray and Lena drove through the night. When they arrived, the man looked older than his age, as if time had been heavy. His hair was thin. His hands shook. His eyes had that distant quality of someone who has lived too long inside fear. Ray sat across from him in a small room that smelled like bleach and tired coffee. The man stared at Ray's badge, then at Ray's face, then down at his own hands. Ray spoke gently. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, then whispered, "Harris." Ray felt Lena's presence behind him like an anchor. "Harris Cole?" Ray asked. The man flinched as if the full name hurt. He swallowed hard. I don't know what I am," he said. Ray didn't rush. He let silence do its work. The man's eyes filled slightly, but tears didn't fall. His body seemed to have forgotten how. "They told me the storm would cover everything," he whispered. "They told me my son would grow up thinking I was dead." Ray's throat tightened. "Jordan." Ray kept his voice calm. "Are you Harris Cole?" he asked again softly. The man nodded once. "Small, terrified. I tried to, he began, then stopped. His hands trembled. I tried to keep them alive. Ray asked about Dean. Merrick. Harris's face collapsed inward like a building losing support. Merrick, he whispered. He got sick. Dean fought. Ray waited. Harris shook his head, eyes wide with a kind of trapped fear. I can't say it, he said. They'll hear. They always hear. Ray leaned forward slightly. Harris, he said, listen to me. The notebook washed ashore. People are arrested. The world knows. They don't own the sea anymore. Harris stared at him like that sentence was impossible. The notebook, he whispered. Ray nodded. Harris's breath hitched, and for the first time, something like relief flickered across his face. He did it, Harris whispered, almost reverent. Dean did it. Ray asked where Dean was. Harris's expression tightened again. I don't know, he said. They moved him. They moved him after he wouldn't sign. Ray asked who they were. Harris shut down immediately, shoulders curling inward like a reflex. Ray didn't push. He knew trauma doesn't respond to pressure. It responds to safety. They took Harris into protective custody. DNA confirmed his identity. Jordan Cole was contacted. That meeting nearly broke the room. Jordan walked in, stiff, eyes hard, prepared to see a lie, prepared to see a con artist, prepared to see anything except the truth. When he saw Harris, he froze. Harris looked up and his face crumpled. Jordan didn't run forward like movies. He didn't collapse into arms. He stood there trembling as if his body didn't know which direction to move. Harris whispered, I'm sorry. Jordan's jaw clenched. His voice came out low and shaking. Where were you? Harris couldn't answer in a clean line. His story came in fragments. Threats, control, new identity, constant monitoring, a life lived in a small cage disguised as freedom. Jordan listened with eyes that looked both furious and devastated. Eventually, he asked the only question that mattered. Did you leave us? Harris's face twisted. No, he whispered. Never. They took me. They used me. I tried to come back. I tried. Jordan's fists clenched, then loosened. He swallowed hard. And Dean? He asked. Merrick? Harris's eyes flicked away. Merrick died, he whispered. Dean, I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Jordan didn't scream. He didn't punch. He just stood there, breathing hard, trying not to fall apart. Later, Naomi Riker arrived. She walked into the room with her spine straight, eyes burning, carrying 30 years of unanswered questions like a weapon. When she saw Harris, she didn't hesitate. Where is my brother? She demanded. Harris flinched. Naomi's voice cracked. Where is Dean? Harris's hands trembled. He looked at Naomi like she was a storm. I don't know, he said. They moved him. He wouldn't cooperate. He kept writing. He kept hiding things. They hated him for it. Naomi's breath hitched. Alive? She demanded. Was he alive when you last saw him? Harris swallowed. Yes, he whispered. He was alive. That single word was both a gift and a curse. Hope is expensive. Ray watched Naomi's face shift through emotions like weather, relief, fury, grief, determination. The case now had something it never had before. A living fisherman. A witness from the inside. Harris was fragile, but with time and safety, he began to speak more. He described being forced to sign papers. He described being told his family was better off, believing he was dead. He described being moved from place to place, used as leverage, threatened whenever he tried to resist. He described Dean hiding the notebook. He described Dean insisting the truth mattered. He described Merrick growing weak. Harris described something else too. A man inside the network who wasn't fully committed. A man who sometimes acted like he wanted to help, but was afraid. He called himself something like Keeper, Harris said once, struggling with memory. He said the sea keeps secrets, but he didn't want it to. He said he'd make it right one day. Ray thought of the final entry in a different hand. We kept this so the truth could surface when it was safe. The Keeper. A person who preserved evidence and timed its release. Ray asked if Harris knew the Keeper's real name. Harris shook his head. I never saw him without a hat, he said. I never saw his eyes fully, but he was the one who said, if the ocean brings something back, don't ignore it. Ray's skin prickled, because that sounded like a warning spoken years ago, and the lifeboat had returned like an answer. The investigation accelerated again. With Harris's testimony, federal teams pushed harder. They traced identities, routes, shell companies. They pressured old officials whose names appeared in old files. They offered deals to lower-level participants, more cracks, more truth. Still, Dean remained missing. That absence became the engine of the final act of the story. The question that refused to leave: if Harris was alive, if Merrick left evidence of his death, if the network cracked, where was Dean? Ray refused to accept a clean, tragic answer without proof. Dean was a writer, the resistor, the one who refused to vanish quietly. People like that often end up punished. But people like that also sometimes end up surviving out of stubbornness alone. Ray and Lena followed the notebook's details again. The citrus air, the facility near water, the pattern of night transfers. They returned to the island port and dug deeper into seized records. The ledger found in the intercepted boat contained codes that matched other codes in old manifests. When cross-referenced with modern shipping data, a pattern emerged. One private dock used repeatedly over decades, always changing ownership, always hiding behind maintenance contracts. They planned another operation. This time, they weren't just looking for cargo. They were looking for a person. The raid was tense, slow, careful. No dramatic explosions, just quiet teams moving like shadows, securing perimeter, cutting locks, opening doors. Inside one warehouse, behind stacked crates, they found a small living area, cot, chair, radio, supplies. Someone had been living there, not comfortably, not freely, but alive. On the wall, carved into wood with something sharp, was a line that made Ray's throat tighten. The sea doesn't forget. Beneath it, another carving, weaker, like the writer's hand had been tired. Tell Naomi I tried. Ray stared. Lena stared. No one spoke for a moment. Ray's hands trembled slightly as he photographed it. Dean. It wasn't proof Dean was alive now, but it was proof he had been here. He had lasted longer than anyone knew. He had remained himself long enough to carve a message. Ray felt anger rise like heat. Anger at the years stolen, anger at the cruelty of systems, anger at the sea being used as a mask. They searched the warehouse thoroughly. They found nothing else. No body, no person, no fresh trace. Whoever lived here had been moved, or had escaped, or had died elsewhere. The uncertainty remained, but the story now had something else. Confirmation that Dean had survived beyond the disappearance. Naomi received the message like a physical blow. She cried in a way that didn't look like comfort. It looked like survival. He tried, she whispered. Of course he did. Ray promised her he would keep searching. The case didn't end in a neat bow. Real life doesn't do that. But it did end with consequences. Arrests, trials, public exposure, networks disrupted. The Lantern Fleet wasn't a ghost story anymore. It was a documented system dragged into daylight by a notebook that refused to drown. Harris Cole entered long-term protection. He began therapy. He began the slow work of learning how to exist without being watched. Jordan visited him, not as a simple reunion, but as a complicated, painful rebuilding. Some days they spoke, some days they sat in silence. That was still something. Silence, when chosen, is different. Marek Sova was brought home. Anya held a memorial that wasn't vague. She didn't say lost at sea. She said what he had been. Taken, used, and finally returned by evidence and stubbornness. The sea, at least, did not get to own his story. Naomi became relentless. She worked with investigators, with journalists, with anyone who could keep pressure on the remaining threads. Dean's disappearance became the last unclosed door. Ray kept the notebook secured, but he thought about it often, about the absurdity of it, about how one small object, protected against impossible odds, had shifted a whole town's understanding of its own horizon. Sometimes late at night, Ray would stand outside the station and look toward the water. The sea would roll in and out like it always did, pretending it was neutral. Ray no longer believed that. Not because the sea was evil, the sea was indifferent, but because people had used that indifference like a weapon, and because someone, Dean or the Keeper or both, had decided the ocean could carry truth when humans refused. The lifeboat did not wash ashore like debris. It washed ashore like a confession, a broken boat, a soaked bag, a dry notebook, aged but readable, and one line that dragged a lie out of the water by its throat. If you found this, we didn't drown. Even after everything, that sentence remained the sharpest hook, because it wasn't just about survival. It was about theft, time stolen, lives stolen, truth stolen, and the ocean, patient as ever, finally returning what it had been forced to hide. Not to be kind, not to be poetic, just because currents, guilt, and human stubbornness eventually collide. Some things don't disappear, they just drift.